Welcome to this webinar on development without aid, debt justice and reparations for systemic change. Today, we will discuss alternatives to development that don't depend on the obsolete, a little bit old forms of development aid that are more based on charity and international funding that we know. We are going to have the presentations by three experts from three different regions who will bring both a perspective from Africa, from Latin America, but also a global perspective on the current state of the foreign debt, the debt crisis in our continent, and what is being done currently in terms of advocacy, of policy advocacy, and the ongoing reforms to achieve development without reliance on external debt. So today we have Priya Lukka, who is an economist and a PhD candidate at the University of Leeds. Mithia, who is the Policy Research and Advocacy Officer for Sovereign Debt Management at the African Forum and Network on Debt Management, AFRODAD. And Daniela Berdeja Ruiz, who is the Sovereign Debt Analyst and Coordinator of the Latin American Vulnerability Atlas at the Latin American Network for Economic, Social, and Climate Justice, LATINDADD. We will start with Priya. Priya is going to bring the perspective of global crisis and what global solutions are being put forward by activists and experts. So Priya, could you please tell us more about what is the current state of the debt crisis globally? And what is your vision for alternatives for development without reliance on external debt? Or what do you think that the future of international solidarity will look like beyond aid? Thank you in advance.
Thank you, Mara, and thank you to Kuja for organizing this discussion. And it's great to be here with AFRODAD, with LATINDADD, with stakeholders on this issue at this time as well, as we are going into a phase where we're having the finance for development discussions happening towards the end of this month, at a critical moment in the way that we consider issues of financial fiscal space for different countries, for governments struggling with the most vulnerable problems of our time at the moment. So I think it's really timely that we're having this discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience as a practitioner, having worked on debt justice and looking at the impact of debt in economic analysis, and more recently spending time mapping what movements who are progressing towards reparations are doing that relates to our resistance and our fight towards neoliberalism. So I think the overall big picture is that for borrower countries, those countries that are really heavily indebted to the likes of the IMF, to other lenders, including those in the Paris Club, they are experiencing overall higher rates of poverty. And these are known effects of IMF loan conditions. They're known to have an impact on poverty. And there's many studies, in fact, that have tracked the impact for low-income countries and middle-income countries of IMF loan arrangements. And this is because they have many structural reforms associated with them, which contribute to more people getting trapped in the poverty cycle. The reforms that go with loans often involve comprehensive changes that tend to raise unemployment, lower government revenue, increase the costs of basic services, lead to restructuring often of tax collection. They often have implications for the way that the pension system works and social security programs. And that's the kind of social and economic analysis of kind of, you know, what the picture of like global debt and its crisis point means right now. But additional to this, what critical scholars have said is that debt and a whole other host of disciplining mechanisms that go with our economic architecture are really essentially today's colonial setup. And debt is actually a really fundamental part of that control. And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. So as I mentioned, there are all these structural conditions that go with taking out debt. So often countries have to deregulate, they have to liberalize, they have to privatize, and they end up losing almost the control over the way that their public sector is shaped and its ownership. Its ownership often ends up in private hands. And this impacts obviously the sovereignty or the kind of autonomy of borrower countries. And then looking at the problems of indebtedness and coping with that debt, many countries have to cut their public budgets as they go along in the cycle of debt. So they take a loan, maybe they can't pay back that loan, they have to restructure that loan. The restructuring comes with conditions. So as part of that strict conditionality, spending on debt servicing can often be going up dramatically, whilst other tracks of spending, public sector spending like education and health spending as a share of GDP can often be declining. And that's often like been a common thing that's tracked in many countries. But there's also many other dire public sector impacts. Also, the IMF can insist on tax changes, sometimes more regressive taxation, so tax on common essentials as a form of revenue collection. A very common policy proposal is for a whole debt renegotiation that really involves kind of the IFIs getting very involved in the economic policies of countries. So that might mean civil service reforms. And that essentially, I'm painting this picture because I think what it's important for us to take on board is that economic, social, and cultural rights, which are an obligation on all countries that are signatory to the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, you'll often see reduced social expenditure lead to actually a decline in social spending, which has an implication for the country meeting its obligation on social and economic spending. And these are all really critical because they relate to kind of the human right for health, the human right to food, the human right to education. Now, today, according to the World Bank, debt repayments, including both domestic and foreign payments, absorb an average of 38% of budget revenue and 30% of spending across the global south. So debt repayments amount to twice of the spending in education, 9.5 times that of health, 13.5 times that of what's spent on social protection. And for countries who report on their climate spending, the debt servicing amounts to 32 times that of what's being spent for tackling climate change. So really, we have to see that every dollar spent on servicing foreign debt is money that's not available then for national economic, social, and climate financing needs. So we are in debt traps, which make the crisis even harder to cope with. Now, just turning to climate change for a moment, every debt crisis or ongoing debt moment actually exacerbates, the climate crisis, and the debt crisis exacerbates the debt. The debt and climate crisis keep compounding each other. So each crisis triggers losses which require more fiscal space. And actually 70% of the climate financing taking place now today across the world is in the form of debt creating loans. So there has been work by Bhumika Michala that's found that the dominant credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's have introduced actually a climate risk susceptibility as a form of debt risk in their sovereign ratings. So that means that it acts as a financial penalty for climate vulnerabilities. But the important thing is here, and this is where the aspect of kind of really understanding coloniality and neocoloniality comes in, that this kind of emission kind of vulnerability has really come in by historical carbon emitter countries. So in 2022, the IPCC said that historical patterns of inequity and colonialism was a real driver of vulnerability to climate change. And really, the planetary boundaries on climate change have been surpassed, not because of our recent patterns of consumption or extraction or development. The historical reappraisal tells us that this is the origins of European and North American capitalism. linked to the oppression of African people who are transported to the Americas, people in Europe and the UK who are forced off their lands and driven into industrial cities, and the First Nations of North American and Australian people who had their land expropriated and became victims of genocide. So therefore, this strategic link between the impacts of climate change and the need for repair from the impacts of transatlantic slavery and colonialism is understood through understanding the kind of ongoing aspect of the impact of land and asset theft and the impact of forced migration and work. So these are not just like one point of crisis in terms of debt, it is all the systems of ongoing oppression around them. And I think for me, I mention this because I think that all of these issues should be of greater relevance for a framework on debt strategies and for decarbonisation moving ahead. So turning to gender and how these crises impact women, people from marginalized groups, they become essentially the shock absorbers as the economic and social rights of women and marginalized groups are really impacted when we see essential public services being cut, such as health, education, and social services. And often what we see is the essential standard of living is eroded. So if there are budget cuts by the state, this might affect programs and services which primarily benefit women, and thereby they're worsening the impact, or they're worsening education opportunities, they're stalling income mobility, and they're exacerbating sometimes consumer debt. Sometimes women are having to take out loans to pay for essential services, and also on social protection transfers, which are so crucial in climate crises and debt crises. Often they're the first areas to be impacted, as the recommendations made to countries in order to agree debt restructuring, which has been the case in some of the countries that I've worked in, is that, you know, the IMF would like social protection to be cut. And these are often critical financial transfers, especially for women who are living in situations of multiple deprivation. So I will turn to the second part of the kind of question of like what the vision can be for alternatives for development without this reliance on external debt. And I just want to start that by saying, like, we know that, you know, vulnerable countries face this structural dependency on international financing, and it's being squeezed by the need for climate finance. So what else can happen? How can finance be structured? And I think that's what we're all like collectively questioning. So where you can go, I mean, you know, often like advocacy around aid and aid spaces has often been for debt pauses, seeing debt as immoral, engaging on reparations, seeing debt as illegitimate, you know, really strong arguments around like what the legitimacy of the conditions and the terms are that loans are taken out in. But I think there's also, you know, arguments that really take a much firmer anti-imperial stance, that see this as a strategy of the bloc of countries that were the colonial powers and that have maintained their power from structuring global finance in this particular way. So what can delinking and what can kind of escaping these mechanisms of economic control and the current economic architecture mean? So I think a lot of it starts with kind of our own education and our own conceptualizations towards like defining what kind of financial systems we want. I think the conceptualization towards debt for influencing campaigning and advocacy is very inspiring here. And I think about the kind of work that the organization, the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development, has done in coining the term ecological debt, also popularized by other climate justice allies in the movement. And this is about really acknowledging that historic polluters have you know, had this kind of idea of rescuing poor victims in the third world. But it's not just about who's bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, something that those people did not cause themselves. It's also about the massive obligation of people who designed the Kyoto Protocol, who owe the Global South a massive debt, a massive ecological debt. And that's where cancellation of sovereign debt as a form of climate reparations and other ideas really take, you know, a big idea, a big systems change idea, to challenge kind of the idea of what, what return, what expropriation, what redistribution, what return of our assets means. It's not just like cancelling the debt, it's kind of really looking at this as a moment of structural change. And you have examples of that in different parts and different geographies of the world where, for example, American municipalities have handed over land titles to First Peoples, or where decision making is set up, where voting structure is weighted to Southern economic agents. So although they may sound like small starting steps, they are part of the journey towards kind of having some form of resistance. And then within that, I think sovereignty towards what the power of the debt system is. I think there's also lots of contradictions in how sovereignty can apply across like the idea of the global and local commons. For example, in the case of the Amazon, it's highlighted that host sovereignty means that collectively, like a very large chunk of area is lost in the Amazon, permitted to be lost every year. And this loss is leading to the violation of rights of indigenous people and forest dwellers whose livelihoods depend on living in the Amazon and its conservation. So again, that concept of repair and reparations is really about democratic transformation, where outcomes for justice can be improved by taking steps to reclaiming sovereignty. So I just wanted to end really by really I know I started in painting the kind of overall picture of debt as something that's really hard to escape, hard to kind of not take the immensity of and feel like, where can we start? But I do want to end by saying that some of the conceptuality on repair and reparations has given a lot of extendability of ideas into re-envisioning the economic problems and the structures that we are binded by. And I think the objective of many reparations initiatives, communities, movements is to address the socioeconomic inequalities that are associated with race, but also, more broadly, the colonial legacies and inequalities, as I explained with ecological debt, applying this into our global justice problems. So some forms of reparations are rooted in the idea of planet repairs, as coined by activists and scholars in the Pan-African reparations movement. Here, there's like a real connection between cognitive justice, reparatory justice, and environmental justice. And there's also a kind of big emphasis on how we are in relationship to one another, to our ancestors, and to spiritual knowledge. And so I guess these terminologies, these different kind of cultural connotations of reparations, even the human rights framings that the UN itself has kind of set out on restoration, returning to original position, restitution, restoring lost items like land, rehabilitation, restoring from damage. All of these family of terminologies are really, like, I think, of value to how we think about global justice and have value for how we think about debt. And so, like, while some of the debates on reparations focus on the need to cause harm that's been caused by institutions and states and the sums that should be paid, there are also broader concepts of reparations that are really entwined with an anti-colonial perspective and that demand radical and justice-driven change. So this is, a much broader notion of reparations I hope to like leave us with as we go through the discussion today, that really hopes to kind of inspire like measures to providing direct ownership and benefits to affected groups, but also to refer to disclosure and acknowledgement and our truth about violations, about responsibility, about the accountability of perpetrators through justice and guarantees of non-repetition. And the final point I'll just make is that a loss of cultural identity is also relevant here. So there is no one blueprint to thinking about reparations, but I think perhaps for us to understand, take on board, take stock of, use as a basis for our own education, for our own knowledge development in how we consider the issue of debt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priya, for this very complete presentation. I will leave some links to your work. So your article, Can Reparations Help Us to Re-envision International Development? It is a little bit older. It is from 2020, but I think it is still valid, especially now that everyone is talking about how to re-envision international development. and your profile from the University of Leeds, so everyone can see. So now we go to Catherine. Catherine Mithia. Mithia is the Policy Research and Advocacy Officer for Sovereign Debt Management at AFRODAD. And we would like to know more, Catherine, about the history and current state of the debt crisis in Africa. How does it differ from crises in other regions or in previous historical moments? And also what solutions AFRODAD has put forward. So what are the proposals on reparations, on reparative justice that AFRODAD has made to address systemic inequalities in Africa that stem from colonialism, from the transatlantic slave trade, and from neocolonialism? Thank you very much in advance.
Thanks, Mara, for the kind introduction, and also to inviting AFRODAD to be part of this wonderful and timely webinar, and also to my fellow panelists, and for Priya for just setting the foundation of the context of this webinar in the discussions. So just share my screen. Maybe perhaps at the risk of repeating some of what Priya has already alluded to, my presentation will just really evolve around the historical perspectives of Africa's debt, of course, from the colonial legacy, and the current Africa debt situation, and then how does debt and reparative justice fit or meaningful in the context of Africa? And then my final presentation will be on what the future of the debt architecture look like, and specifically around the debts, or rather reparations, but also the UN Framework Convention on debt. So just as an introduction on history of Africa's debt, as you know, as Priya has already alluded, there's some linkages to colonial legacy of not only Africa's debt, but debts in regions like Latin America, and also bits of Asia as well. So for Africa, of course, the debt challenges are very much linked to the structure of colonial economies that were there during the colonial period, where it was a system of extraction and exploitation of valuable resources from the continent. And any infrastructure that was put to facilitate this extraction was only served to connect, rather it was just linking where the extraction was taking place directly to the ports, which were now extracted from the countries. So it was the kind of economies that persisted at that time were really of an extractive nature, and it was not really to develop, of course, the regions where this colonial governments operated in, and they only served as bases for resource extraction. And at that time, it was that push for industrialization for the colonizing countries. So of course, there was no financing for domestic productive capacities of the colonized countries. There was nothing to do with strengthening the value chains of production, or even diversifying the economy basis. So this was not really their priority. The priority was just to get raw materials, get it out of the continent and of the colonized countries into the industrial governments of the colonizing governments. So just to give an example, also how some of these structures came to be, and also how to explain a bit of even the debt situation some African countries found themselves into, and what Priya has actually alluded to. is that colonial governments did borrow extensively to develop these infrastructures, which later turned out to be liabilities for African governments. So for the example of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was at that time referred to as Zaire, the King Leopold II of Belgium actually borrowed equivalent of $500,000, which is the equivalent to the current currency valuation right now, to develop to build some of the infrastructure at that time, which is a debt that the government of Zaire actually borrowed or actually took after independence and had to pay, even though they were not the beneficiaries and actually were the most affected in this kind of engagement. And of course, after many countries began getting their independence, African countries were taking up this debt, which is now what we're referring as being odious in nature, because it was never accepted or approved by the citizens. It was not, it did not benefit the people, but it actually led to limiting the resources available that would be invested in the people's needs at that time. And then just fast forward to now post-independence debt and what the legacy of dependency, how it really began. And legacy of dependency, I mean on borrowing. The newly formed African governments, because of lack of expertise on how to mobilize resources. These are just new governments. They're coming out of colonial rule. They don't have sufficient reserves to attract capital flows. Then the next, the thinking at that time, of course, with the elite government of the elite or leaders that came in to take over the governments, the thinking was, then how do we develop our economies? For them, they were forced to actually borrow because, like I've already indicated, some were actually left in debt. They don't have the resources, they don't have the capabilities to mobilize domestically, so they were forced to borrow. And of course, the extraction economic structure was left by the colonial government, and the minimal infrastructure that was there. It was then obviously that they were forced to borrow externally to finance these development projects. And also by the nature of the economies that the colonial governments left, they were very cash-based economies. They were not diversified to, for example, to facilitate production of other food crops. So it meant that there was limited, resources available from this cash-based sort of economic activities. So then with the borrowing, it was mostly concessional because it was governments, of course, the colonial governments, facilitating finances to their colonial the former colonials. At that time, it was concessional at low interest, but it was to be tied to specific projects and to, of course, benefit the lending countries. So, for example, you'd find the governments would, extend loans for projects where they'd be the ones to export or benefit from the exportation of some of the goods. At this time, also commercial debt started featuring, colonial, the now free or independent governments were borrowing commercially, and it was mostly to facilitate export credit agencies, and which led to increasing the lenders' export profits. And from this, you can see the continuation of the extractivism nature that had already been established by colonial governments. And these projects really ended up not being productive or insufficient to service the loans. And by the time you're coming to the 1970s, there was a lot of responsible lending from both private and official creditors. Of course, this was at the time of the commodity boom as well. So they were taking advantage of that period. We are developing economies, and Africa, to be specific, general, was also being targeted as a major export market. So with this continuous or increase in borrowing, coming up to the 1980s, African countries were highly indebted, and of course, because of the nature of the goods that they were exporting, they were heavily affected at that time by decreased prices, so which led to them a reduction in, of course, the reserves, or rather the revenues they were earning, and this were now unable to service their debts. So by the time it was coming to the 1980s, there were very high debt levels, continued massive borrowing to facilitate repayment. Of course, at that time, those inflation in European countries and also North America, because, like I mentioned, decline in export commodity prices. And then, of course, at that time, these institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, came in as saviors to bail out African countries of this debt situation they were finding themselves in. So there was massive lending to African countries, but these were tied to policy conditionalities, which are now famously known as structural adjustment programs, which were just, as a way to make sure that African countries were going to repay. And the IMF and World Bank put conditions to the loans. So, for example, governments were required to either increase their taxes, devalue their currencies, in the guise that it would make them earn more foreign exchange. You'd find that for other governments, they were actually asked to privatize the institutions. And if anyone knows, between the 1980s and 90s, many African governments, or rather, many people suffered job losses because with the privatization, it meant they could not absorb a very heavy workforce. So with the structural adjustment programs, it felt, or it was viewed as another instrument of neocolonialism, where former colonial governments, which of course their major shareholders, the major shareholders of within IMF and World Bank, they offered loans to African countries in return for reforms that exposed these countries to multinational corporation investments, or expose them to this dependency where they were relying on loans, but in return, it is actually these former colonial governments that were benefiting from the repayments made by the African governments. So fast forward to the 90s, African countries are highly indebted, economies are extremely vulnerable at this point, but there's still increase in multilateral finance from the IMF and World Bank with unacceptable policy conditionalities. So in the 2000s, there was agitation by civil society organizations. And of course, by that time, there had been a series of unrests across the continent, just, by how it was, this policy conditionalities were actually affecting the citizens. So the government were actually raising concerns about how this was affecting them. And it was, whereas the loans are supposed to help them build the economies, it was, the opposite. So those increased agitation from civil society organization, fake race movements, which led to the Jubilee 2000 campaign, and eventually led to the conditional debt cancellation through the HIPIC and MDRI initiatives. So just an overview of how Africa's debt, and of course the pre-colonial, rather the colonial legacy of Africa's debt started. And then just coming to the current Africa's debt situation, of course, coming to the 2000s, after the debt cancellation, African countries were now, expanded their creditor portfolios, and they were now, were able to access private, rather commercial markets. And therefore, we've seen over the last 10, 15 years a change in the creditor landscape towards more private borrowing or borrowing from private creditors compared to the 90s and 2000s, which was mostly bilateral and multilateral. So with that, the debt architecture as it looks like right now for African countries as borrowers is where you have the lenders on the far right, of course, still the bilateral, multilaterals, and more on the commercial lenders. We have new debt instruments that have come into play. For example, you have now debt swaps, the bonds, the public-private partnerships. And then, of course, with the governance, it has not increasingly changed from what it was in the 90s and 2000s, but the mandate has, of course, expanded. Now we have beyond the IMF, as they were, the World Bank, the UN, credit rating agencies have become very much instrumental and also influential in how debt is being contracted and how it affects actually borrowing for African countries. And of course, capital markets, African governments have developed their domestic markets, and of course, with the access of international markets, has seen the debt composition change significantly. Just an overview of what that looks like, we can see between 2010 and 2021, the figures are not really significantly changed. You can see that the private creditor position has actually increased for African countries, whereas for bilateral and multilateral has also, especially for bilateral, has declined. For multilateral, it has also increased, but not as much as for private creditors. And this is just another.
Sorry to bother you, but you have like two more minutes to present. So
okay. So this is just an overview of. Thanks, Mara, for that. So this is just how Africa's debt has really changed between the debt relief initiatives of HIPIC and MDRI, where now it is highly non-concessional, high interest rates, meaning the cost of borrowing is significantly high. It also means that the players have also changed. We now have new bilaterals like China and United Arab countries who have, increasingly lending to African countries, but their terms are not necessarily concessional, which has very much affected the debt composition and the increase of debt that we've seen over the 10, 15 years. So looking back also, the structure of debt might have changed, but the structure of the extractivism has not significantly changed. Many African countries are still reliant on exports. They have and exports that are not do not have any value addition or very little value addition, meaning that they receive foreign currency in the levels that do not are not able to sustain their economies, and also they're now borrowing more in foreign currency at high interest rates, meaning that repayment is becoming very burdensome for them. So just to come to what now reparations mean, and in the context of debt, I won't go into the definitions of reparations, but looking at the injustices that you've seen through colonialism, how that has led to debt dependency, economic extraction that still persists, but more so the underdevelopment, then there's a case for reparations, especially for African countries. And how do you frame that narrative of reparations, and that can lead to transformation and lead from this extractivism that you've seen from global north countries, the neoliberal policies through the fiscal consolidation of the structural adjustment programs that were there. How do that framing look like? So for narrative, is to say that there's a case for reparations, and it's a valid framework to review these injustices that were perpetuated in the continent. And it's also a political ideology that we feel can really bring a change in reviewing neoliberal capitalism and extractivism, and can achieve a renewed framing of how development should look like, which is equitable, it is fair, it is just, and offers development. And reparation should be people-centered. And it's a framing about restoring the dignity of African citizens, and not mortgaging their futures further. Just to conclude on now, beyond reparations, they need a systemic change of the debt architecture. And one of the proposals right now for the in the upcoming Financing for Development conference is to have a UN Framework Convention on Debt. And for us, together with many other civil societies, this will be the ultimate reform of the debt architecture, where we have binding responsible lending and borrowing principles. We have independent debt sustainability frameworks that fairly assess debt sustainability for developing economies, but it's also a way of having fair debt restructuring principles. I think Priya has already alluded to that. And this will, in many ways than one, actually begin that process of reparations for African countries away from this unfair debt system. So just also as part of the demands for the debt architecture, and linking it to the on what the future of debt would look like, is to have even reforms of the IMF and World Bank governance with their voting power, and how it reflects currently to the population, which does not lead to equal financial distribution or even decision making. But it also will reform on how governments borrow, and allow governments to borrow most of African economies in local currencies, right? And again, from what Priya has mentioned on climate reparations, these are some of the demands beyond the reform of the debt architecture, and also within the question of reparations. So just to conclude, and it's something that we as AFRODAD family believe in, we call them the 3 Ps, and how African can be a rule maker, not a rule taker, where with power, we need new participation for African countries, And there should be a new political order that is fit for Africa and Africans. And finally, the people, which as envisioned in Agenda 2063, that the ones who are going to take Africa to the next level of development. And therefore, there should be an appreciation of this, even with the push for a reformed global financial architecture. So that is all from my end. Mara, thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this extremely complete presentation about the situation in Africa. I really appreciate you preparing such a thorough presentation, especially for the ones of us who don't know the situation in the African continent. So thank you very much. Now we will have Daniela Berdeja. Daniela will be presenting in Spanish. So please, if you don't speak Spanish, go to the translation link, the interpretation link, and choose English so that you can listen to the presentation in English. I will copy it again. So Daniela, we want to know your perspective and the perspective of LATINDADD regarding the current debt in Latin America. How is it different from previous crises, debt crisis? And what are the specific alternatives and recommendations by LATINDADD about debt justice and structural reform of the neoliberal global financial architecture, especially when it comes to Latin America? Thank you very much in advance, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Mara, and thank you for inviting me and LATINDADD to be part of this panel. It's a pleasure to share this event with Priya and with Catherine. I don't know if you hear me well, because I am having some my connection. Okay, I will turn my camera off so I don't have any problem, and I will share my screen. As you were saying, I will be presenting in Spanish. So if there is any issue with the translation, let me know so I can change to English, sorry. But the presentation, yes, it is in English, so it will help me, I think, deliver the messages. We're turning on my camera. Muchas gracias también a Priya y a Catherine por sentar las bases para esta discusión. Todo lo que han dicho es sumamente importante y a partir de ello me permite centrarme específicamente en lo que está pasando en América Latina. Lo primero que voy a hacer es mostrarles una foto. Voy a mostrarles unos gráficos a partir de los cuales quiero que nos quedemos con 3 mensajes. Hay mucho por decir sobre la deuda en el sur global y particularmente en América Latina, pero me voy a centrar en 3 aspectos importantes. Aquí tenemos una foto de cómo está la deuda, cómo está creciendo. Desde el 2002 al 2008 vemos ahí una reducción que tiene que ver con lo que igual Catherine comentaba sobre los procesos de alivio de deuda. En este caso, en ese periodo de tiempo fue el alivio de deuda externa multilateral. Y a partir de ahí vemos una tendencia que ha ido creciendo y que se ha exacerbado a partir de la pandemia, ¿no? Sin embargo, el primer mensaje es que en la región esta acumulación de deuda es heterogénea, ¿no? No hay un crecimiento para casi todos los países, pero algunos han acumulado más que otros. Sin embargo, los altos costos, una deuda muy costosa, sí está mucho más, digamos, distribuida entre todos los países de la región. Y ahí lo que les muestro es qué parte de los ingresos públicos, qué parte de los ingresos fiscales se está destinando al pago solamente de intereses de la deuda. Hay que entender que una vez que nosotros adquirimos un crédito, para ir repagando o haciendo la devolución de este crédito, pagamos un servicio que está compuesto por 2 partes. Por un lado, la amortización, que tiene que ver con la devolución misma del capital, Y sobre ello, la segunda parte son los intereses que pagamos por esa deuda. En este momento, en América Latina, al igual que en otras regiones, la deuda es sumamente costosa y no solo en términos financieros, ya lo voy a mostrar más adelante, sino también en términos sociales y ambientales. Entonces, ese es el primer mensaje. Aquí, en esta segunda slide que tengo, solamente quisiera que nos centremos en el gráfico de la derecha. Parece un poco lleno, pero quisiera que miremos las líneas naranjas que muestran la tasa de interés que se está pagando por la deuda externa, ya sea con prestamistas del sector privado o prestamistas de lo que le llaman el sector oficial, que está compuesto por otros países que están aglomerados en el Club de París y las instituciones multilaterales. Como ven en la línea naranja hay un crecimiento importante en la tasa de interés que nos están imponiendo en los créditos que contratamos en los últimos años. Esto está llevando obviamente a que el peso de la deuda crezca mucho en términos de nuestros presupuestos y en la capacidad que tienen los estados para cumplir con sus obligaciones más básicas como la garantía de derechos humanos, eliminación de la pobreza, reducción de desigualdades. Y eso es como lo que está detrás de lo que está impulsando esta nueva crisis de deuda, que no tiene que ver solo con deuda más alta, sino también con servicio o con intereses de la deuda mucho más elevados. El segundo mensaje que me gustaría mostrarles, y este gráfico está preparado para América Latina y el Caribe, pero es muy similar el comportamiento en otros continentes como África o Asia. Y es que a partir de este alto costo, esta presión que la deuda está generando en las economías del sur, vemos que hay una salida de flujos financieros, de dinero de nuestras economías por concepto de deuda externa. Ya, como bien lo han explicado tanto Priya como Catherine, la deuda, hay una salida, hay un comportamiento, si quieren, colonial y extractivo de nuestras economías desde hace muchos años, en los que vemos que salen recursos, se explota la mano de obra en nuestras economías, en las que vemos que incluso por concepto de evasión, flujos financieros ilícitos, los recursos fluyen del sur hacia el norte, ¿no? Y en este caso, cuando miramos la deuda, ese patrón se está repitiendo en economías del sur. Este gráfico muestra todo el dinero que entra por deuda externa, es decir, desembolsos, menos todo el dinero que sale por concepto del pago de la deuda del servicio. Y vemos que estamos en terreno ya negativo desde hace varios años y esto quiere decir que está saliendo más dinero del que está entrando. No significa que nos prestemos menos del sector externo o del extranjero, sino esa deuda ha seguido aumentando. Lo que significa es que más bien nuestro dinero ha ido en mayor proporción, ha crecido en mayor proporción el dinero que estamos pagando por esa deuda. Entonces, ese es el segundo mensaje. Y hay una salida negativa de flujos. Y el tercer mensaje es que a partir de todo esto, este peso que está generando la deuda en la economía, en nuestros presupuestos, vemos que cada vez, como igual Priya lo comentaba, tenemos menor espacio para financiar sectores clave de la economía como salud, educación, protección social, acción climática. Aquí lo que muestro es la relación entre la cantidad de dinero que se destina al pago del servicio de la deuda versus la cantidad de dinero que se destina a educación, a salud y a protección social en diferentes economías de América Latina. Y en muchos casos, este pago del servicio ya está superando el gasto social, Lo que significa que esta crisis de deuda, que a veces la vemos muy macro, se traduce en una crisis de desarrollo, se traduce en una crisis social, se traduce en una crisis de condiciones de vida, en una crisis de pobreza. Entonces, todo está interrelacionado y creo que hoy el desafío más urgente es atender estas necesidades de la población en un contexto de crisis múltiple. Particularmente me refiero a la emergencia climática, pero además hay otras, ante un espacio fiscal muy reducido, ante cada vez menos recursos para poder financiar esas necesidades y que al final disminuyen las posibilidades de cumplir con el, con la garantía de derechos humanos. Eh, ya Priya, Catherine han explicado muy bien muchas de las fallas del sistema financiero global, de la arquitectura internacional de la deuda, en la que prácticamente hay un no sistema, las iniciativas no están respondiendo a las necesidades de los países. Y yo tengo una serie de críticas que no quise poner acá en la presentación, pero quería centrarme en los dos últimos puntos, haciendo un llamado a, desde una mirada de las reparaciones, y de ponerle fin a esta dinámica colonial de la deuda, dos demandas muy grandes que tenemos en este momento. La primera es que sí necesitamos alivio de deuda, condonación, anulación de la deuda para todos aquellos países que lo necesiten, independientemente de su clasificación, si son de ingreso medio, de ingreso bajo. Para todos aquellos países que necesiten alivio de deuda, debería ser proporcionada desde la comunidad financiera internacional. Pero si bien en el pasado, igual Catherine lo mostraba, han habido iniciativas de alivio como la HIPIC, que era la condonación para países pobres altamente endeudados, y la multilateral que les comentaba al inicio, necesitamos ir un paso más allá. Em, Necesitamos alivio ahora, sí, pero una manera también de generar reparaciones y un sistema que sea justo para los países del sur es reformar el sistema que está roto y que no está respondiendo a las necesidades ni a los desafíos actuales. Es un sistema que se ha construido después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, con un contexto completamente diferente, unas dinámicas económicas completamente diferentes, y hoy tenemos un mundo además mucho más expuesto y más propenso a shocks y crisis globales. ¿Cómo vemos la reforma entonces? Vámonos más allá de la ayuda, porque sí es importante que los países cumplan con la ayuda oficial al desarrollo, con el financiamiento climático, que sean ambiciosos, que entreguen estos financiamientos de manera rápida, justa, sin aumentar la deuda, pero más allá de eso, necesitamos garantizar justicia de deuda. Y como igual lo mencionaba Catherine, hemos estado trabajando LATINDADD, AFRODAD y otras organizaciones hermanas en esta propuesta que tiene que ver con una convención en Naciones Unidas sobre la deuda. Uno de los principales problemas hoy es que quienes toman decisiones y todos los foros están centrados en los acreedores, en los que prestan el dinero. Entonces el sistema juega siempre a favor de estos acreedores. Y que los países que recibimos los impactos de las decisiones no tenemos voz y voto al momento de diseñar las políticas globales, en este caso de la deuda. ¿Qué implica esta convención? ¿Por qué en Naciones Unidas? Primero, es importante fortalecer el multilateralismo. Segundo, en Naciones Unidas porque no es acreedor, no es deudor y se convierte en un espacio independiente al tiempo que también es democrático, porque un país tiene siempre un voto, ¿no? Independiente si es del norte, si es del sur, si es economía avanzada, si es economía en desarrollo, emergente. Entonces creemos que este espacio puede convertirse en un espacio mucho más inclusivo y equitativo. La idea de la convención es que se acuerde, se llegue a un consenso con todos los países del mundo sobre las reglas, principios y estructuras para abordar los problemas de la deuda en todo el ciclo del endeudamiento. es decir, desde que uno se presta hasta que uno repaga, hay un montón de etapas y que todas tienen muchas fallas y sesgos en contra de las poblaciones más vulnerables, como por ejemplo las mujeres, las poblaciones indígenas. Aquí voy a mencionar algunos de estos, de lo que esta convención, algunos de las reformas que esta convención podría abordar. Primero, tener un mecanismo de resolución de deudas en Naciones Unidas que sea multilateral y que funcione de manera permanente. La idea es que en este mecanismo le dé voz justo a los países deudores, que muchas veces son puestos en una mesa injusta de negociación donde están todos los acreedores privados, multilaterales, bilaterales, con todo su poder de negociación, versus un país que está en condiciones críticas, normalmente ya en crisis de deuda y sin poder atender las necesidades de su población. Entonces necesitamos esto y que este mecanismo pueda incluir además la necesidad de anulación incondicional de la deuda a partir de un análisis de si las deudas son ilegítimas, si son odiosas, si son injustas, si son insostenibles. Entonces, esto es importante, este es uno de los más importantes avances que consideramos se puede llevar a cabo. De hecho, en este momento se están negociando muchos temas alrededor de esto, lo podemos comentar en la sección de preguntas, y es importante avanzar en esto para incluir a todos los países que necesiten acudir a una reestructuración sin que se les impongan condiciones. Además, se podría acordar una anulación del servicio de la deuda automático cuando un país enfrenta shocks, cuando, por ejemplo, la pandemia o cuando hay eventos climáticos extremos o shocks de seguridad o económicos que golpeen de manera fuerte a un país, el país debería dejar de pagar su deuda durante un periodo determinado para tener espacio y responder a ese shock. Además, igual lo mencionaba Catherine, es importantísimo implementar los principios de préstamo y endeudamiento responsable de manera vinculante. Estos principios existen. Lo que necesitamos es que se implementen porque muchas veces cuando hay una crisis de deuda, se dice que el país que se ha prestado dinero es el que ha manejado mal su deuda, es el país que es su propia responsabilidad estar en esa situación, cuando hay también una responsabilidad de quien le presta, sabiendo que, que ya tiene un nivel de deuda insostenible o incluso sabiendo que ese dinero va a ser mal utilizado y en muchos casos en contra de la población misma de ese gobierno. Entonces es importante implementar estos principios como una manera también de poner justicia en el sistema. También es importante las auditorías de deuda. Esto lo he incluido aquí porque nos va a permitir determinar si hay deudas ilegítimas que deban ser anuladas. Y esto, como les digo, es una manera de justicia de deuda que además va más allá de lo que hablábamos de la ayuda, ¿no? Es otra manera de reducir este peso injusto de la deuda. Para eso es necesario transparencia, saber cuánto se le debe, a quién se le debe, en qué condiciones se ha generado ese préstamo. Y en este momento no hay suficiente transparencia ni rendición de cuentas por parte de ni acreedores ni deudores. Entonces, la idea es que se pueda establecer un registro público a nivel global de toda la deuda, donde todos los que prestan y los que se prestan registren la deuda y un ciudadano pueda entrar al sistema y revisar si su país se está endeudando y para qué y con quién y en qué condiciones. Pero es necesario que los estados acuerden iniciar este registro público de deuda. Y adicionalmente necesitamos cambiar radicalmente el enfoque de cómo entendemos la sostenibilidad de la deuda. Está orientada únicamente a garantizar el repago y los intereses de los prestatarios, del sector privado, de los países del norte, de las instituciones financieras multilaterales, y necesitamos que este enfoque más bien priorice y ponga en el centro las necesidades más básicas como el cumplimiento de los derechos humanos, em, el cierre de brechas y eliminación de problemas de carácter social, la eliminación de desigualdades de género, la atención oportuna del cambio climático y otros factores que hacen a la vida de las personas y que hoy no son considerados en estos análisis. Desde América Latina, algo que sí estamos demandando es que se expanda el acceso a financiamiento concesional más allá del criterio del ingreso per cápita. Y aquí sí necesitamos dinero que llegue a nuestros países, pero en condiciones justas, con plazos de vencimiento muy largos, porque invertir en salud y en educación no va a generar resultados en el corto plazo, va a tardar décadas en generarse resultados positivos. Necesitamos deuda y que sea lo más concesional posible. Con concesional me refiero a en condiciones sumamente favorables, bajas tasas de interés y largos periodos para repagar la deuda. Y bueno, ya también se ha mencionado en la discusión, regular las agencias de calificación crediticia e incluso se habla de generar o crear una pública. Ahí quiero ir cerrando con un último mensaje. No queremos más políticas de austeridad. Igual lo han mencionado mis colegas en sus presentaciones. Han generado mucho daño en América Latina. Lo hemos vivido en los 90. Particularmente hemos perdido una década de desarrollo a partir de esto. Y hoy lo que necesitamos, estamos en un momento súper crítico. Necesitamos poner a la vida antes que la deuda y a la vida antes que cualquier interés financiero. Ahí me quedo y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I leave the link to LATINDADD's website so that if anyone wants to know more about this, they can check it out. And thank you very much for also your thorough presentation on what is going on in Latin America now. And again, the attendees, if you have any questions, that would be great. Anyway, we have 6 more minutes of webinar. So I would like to leave with some kind of lesson learned or recommendation that we can give to the audience as to how to get involved in these conversations. We know that someone who is not an economist and who doesn't understand economy won't be able to get or might not be able to get involved in the more technical conversations like the ones that you're involved with at high level decision making fora. That will probably not happen. But what is your recommendation of one discussion that we can get involved in or a discussion that we can follow that is very relevant now and that could make a difference? Or you know what you would like to recommend? Priya talked about climate change. I know that AFRODAD and LATINDADD have made research on gender and the debt crisis, so how it affects mainly women. Priya also mentioned that. So it would be nice to know more about that. And we can go in reverse order. So Daniela, then Catherine, and then Priya. Thank you.
Sure. Voy a continuar en español. Sí, me parece es un tema muy relevante y creo que tenemos que empezar a pensar en que es necesario reparaciones por todos estos siglos de destrucción de nuestros propios medios de vida que hemos tenido en el sur. Y necesitamos que la ayuda oficial al desarrollo, que el financiamiento climático lleguen, pero también necesitamos, como decía en la presentación, reformar el sistema, pensar más allá, pensar fuera de la caja. Para eso necesitamos que los países, los tomadores de decisiones, tengan la voluntad política para responder a estas necesidades. Y hoy sí me gustaría quizás resaltar para que quienes nos acompañan hoy lo tengan en mente. Estamos a un mes o menos de la cuarta conferencia de financiamiento para el desarrollo, donde se están tomando en este momento decisiones justamente sobre estos temas. Entonces, es necesario empujar a nuestros gobiernos a que avancen en estas reformas Porque en Naciones Unidas, países como los de América Latina, los de África, incluso las islas más pequeñas que tienen un bloque conformado en Naciones Unidas, pueden proponer las reformas, pueden ser aliados e impulsar, porque en Naciones Unidas todos van a tener esa voz, ese voto, y ahora, en este momento, podemos iniciar ese cambio. No es que lo vamos a generar de un día para el otro, pero hoy podemos plantar esa semilla de cambio. Y más allá de eso, sí es importante mirar a la deuda en el centro de toda la política fiscal en cada uno de nuestros países, que tiene impactos en género, que tiene impactos en clima, que tiene impactos en la vida diaria de cada persona. La deuda no es solamente un dato, un número, un monto de dinero. Detrás de estas decisiones está obviamente la vida de las personas.
Wonderful. And Catherine, what is one recommendation that you can give for people to get involved in this topic? If you're okay.
Thanks, Mara, and also to Daniela for those concluding remarks. I think most of them is what I wanted to say, but just also add that citizens are actually the more affected in debt contraction, whereas they're the ones going to pay the taxes, going to repay this debt. And if what Daniela has already alluded to, now developing countries are spending more on debt servicing than social sector spending, meaning that they are not accessing services in timely manner or in a cost-effective way, meaning the quality of life is not what would support economic development for countries. So I think this is the right opportunity, and it has always been for citizens to engage in these conversations, take charge during, for example, budget conversations, understand why your government is borrowing. But that is, of course, at the national level. But at the regional level, task organizations such as the African Union in the implementation of Agenda 2063 in a way that will lead the continent according to the aspirations indicated within the Agenda 2063 for the Africa that we want. And of course, at the global level, civil society, we continue to provide this information, engage at the community level. Thank you so much, Mara, for organizing such a platform where we can actually provide this higher level observations of the system and how it affects the people, and how then they can start be interested in the conversations. Any impact is no little, it's not little. There's nothing like because, for example, I'm not in civil society or I do not have an economic background. You are affected as a person as long as debt is part of the conversation. So you should be able to communicate your needs and ensure the system works for you. So I'd say in those different levels, there's always opportunity for citizens to participate. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Catherine, for your recommendations and your suggestions about what we can do. And Priya, what is your one recommendation you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just echoing what's already been suggested already by Daniela and Catherine, I'd really support that and just say that there are a lot of movements in different contexts, in different regions, and in different national settings who are working towards justice goals that are like expressions of like resistance to neoliberal policies on debt. And I think a great place to start is just seeing what is there in different settings and kind of expressions of allyship and solidarity can be, really important in kind of furthering the work of movements. And I think that, you know, the idea of like democratic transformation really starts, like, as has been said, with the individual. And I think that we are at a time where there is like a lot of accountability that's being probed on global harms of all kinds in the world that we see right now. And I think that the way that the financial architecture works is a key part of maintaining that, even the military harms that we see. So I think this is a time to kind of, you know, voice our outrage in as loud a way as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And however we can also, yeah. So thank you very much again for preparing such thorough presentations. I will watch them again because, again, I don't understand 100% of everything, but I will watch them again and become more well educated about the debt crisis and debt justice thanks to your presentations. They were great, and I really, really appreciate them. Soon we will post a summary of this webinar. We will post the video on the website and on YouTube so that anyone who is interested in learning more can watch it. And everyone has your website so they can look for more information if they want to, especially the research that you have made, which is very thorough. Also, the three of you, LATINDADD, AFRODAD, and Priya. So thank you very much again. I really appreciate it, and we will be in touch. Have a nice evening or afternoon or morning, and hope
Thank
to
you
see you
very
soon.
much.
Thank you, Mara. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.